start today talking about the leadership for both the North and the South. Very briefly, the political leadership. These are just two figures that you really ought to know. And then some more with the military leadership of both North and South, at least some of the key players. And so these are each of the presidents of their respective nations. Of course, you should hopefully know that Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States through the Civil War. And in fact, that his election is one of the things that precipitated the secession of the South and therefore the war itself. The other fellow there to the right is Jefferson Davis. Jeff Davis was a senator from Mississippi who was elected in Alabama when they were creating the Confederate States of America and its Constitution. He was chosen to be their first president. He will also end up being their only president, as he never finishes his first term. The Confederate States isn't around long enough to do that or to have an actual election. And so on to the military leadership. The Union, as we've mentioned before, had a lot of problems with their military leadership. The fellow who was the chief of staff, sort of overall in charge of the Army, was named Winfield Scott. And General Winfield Scott, he was old by this point. He had fought in the War of 1812. He had fought in the Mexican War. He's, for example, the man who led the invasion of Mexico and the capture of Mexico City, which pretty much ended the war. So he's not going to have any battlefield commands in this war. He's more in charge of the Army as an organization rather than leading it in battle. But he does create the Anaconda Plan. The overall strategy of the Union forces is his idea. George McClellan, one of the several generals chosen to be in charge of the Army of the Potomac, he is one of the first to be in charge of the Army of the Potomac. And he will be, his problem is that he's excellent at building an army. And he really was. He managed to get his army put together and trained and well equipped and well organized and all of those things he was very, very good at. What he was not great at was aggression. And you don't want blind aggression, but you need some aggression. And his flaw was that he was just too cautious with his soldiers. And it made him very popular with the soldiers because they never really felt like he just threw them away where there was little to no chance of victory, or that he didn't care about their survival and their being provided for. So he was very popular with the soldiers, but he was not effective in doing the thing that he needed to do, which is crushing the Army of Northern Virginia, which was the South's main army. So that's his big flaw, and it's going to haunt him. Ulysses S. Grant, one of the more famous generals, probably the most famous general for the Union side in the war. He first fought out in the West. He had been a soldier. He had gone to West Point and graduated last in his class. Had fought in the Mexican-American War, had left the Army, had gone into just private business life where he was not very successful, honestly. Then he rejoined the military when the Civil War began and quickly rose through the ranks because, well, he was actually pretty good at this and fought mostly in the West at first. He's, for example, the man who will end up taking Vicksburg. He fought at Shiloh. He was not subtle. He was not cautious. He fought and he won. And he did it by realizing that he had something the South didn't, which is numbers. He understood the benefit that he had and was absolutely willing to just smash his enemy, hold on to him, and keep pounding him. He was famous for being a heavy drinker, and his enemies, and he had plenty. There were plenty of people who didn't like him. McClellan was one of them, who tried to have him dismissed, tried to convince Lincoln to fire him. Lincoln would say, "I can't spare this man. He fights." when they brought up his drinking to Lincoln, Lincoln supposedly said, what kind of whiskey does he drink? I'll have a case sent to all of my generals. So he's an effective general, though not a popular one. And William T. Sherman, who was a favorite of Grant's, he's going to lead the March to the Sea, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Once said, war is hell. He understood that war was a devastating consequence, a devastating prospect, but also believed that the best way to end a war was to end it fast. And if that meant being very hard for a short time, he believed that that would be the best thing, because overall it would save lives and effort and all of that. And so here's Major General Ulysses S. Grant, who will later become a president of the United States. We have a history of liking to elect successful generals. Zachary Taylor, Andrew Jackson, George Washington, all those gentlemen had been successful generals prior to Grant. Since then, Eisenhower springs to mind as a general who was elected on his military reputation following World War II. So it's not an uncommon thing. Teddy Roosevelt, who wasn't a general, but he was a military leader in the Spanish-American War, helps get him elected as vice president and then as president. So it's a factor. On the southern side, we're only going to talk about three gentlemen here. Robert E. Lee, absolutely the most famous, probably the most famous general of the Civil War, and possibly one of the most famous generals of all American history. And there's a reason for it. He was a pretty darn good general. At least he was when we were talking about maneuvering and defensive fighting. He was not as good at strategic offensives. Both of his major strategic offensives in this war are failures. They were partly because he was being pushed to do it, but the big thing is he never really had the forces to honestly go on the offensive, and that was a big mistake. So he made mistakes. He was a very popular general with both his men, and after the war, he maintained his popularity. Heck, he was even popular in the North. At one point, Lincoln had considered offering command of the Army of the Potomac to Lee. This, of course, being before Lee went with Virginia when Virginia seceded. So he was commander of the Army of Northern Virginia for most of the war. Basically, he takes over after the first Bull Run and will run the Army for the rest of the war. And he does survive the war. He makes it all the way through. So did Grant. They're the ones that are going to sign the surrender later on at Appomattox. Thomas Stonewall Jackson, possibly the best tactician of the war as far as being able to actually fight out the battle. He had been a math teacher at a military college prior to the war. He was an odd sort of fellow. He had some kind of odd ideas and beliefs. Among other things, he thought that his body was lopsided, so he would raise his arm into the air to drain the fluids from that side back over to the other. And he would do it just, for example, as he was lecturing in his math course, he would just raise his hand and continue talking and just go on and on and on. He was also a very devout man, was very religious. He was just an interesting fella. He would die during the war of pneumonia, the infection coming after a surgery when he was shot accidentally by his own troops. And one of the more colorful fellows, Jeb Stuart, J.E.B. Stuart, is James Edward, John Edward Buell, something like that. Doesn't matter. Everybody called him Jeb Stuart. He was by far the best cavalry general of the war. His job was to keep men on horses between Lee's troops and whoever Lee was fighting. And by doing that, he could see where the enemy was and keep the enemy from seeing where Lee's troops were. It was all about scouting and reconnaissance, and he was extremely good at it. And He's flamboyant. He dressed very fashionably. He had a big plume in his hat, grew out a big beard, and was just a manly man, and yet quite well dressed, very well spoken. He was big time ladies' man. He very hot tempered and not popular with everyone. He had insulted one of his subordinates at one point, and the fellow decided that he couldn't call out Stuart for a duel because you can't challenge your superiors in the military to a duel. And so he decides he's going to murder Stuart. And so he goes into Stuart's tent on some pretense or another, pulls his gun, shoots Stuart. Stuart throws over his desk, pulls his sword, jumps over the desk, and slashes the man, shouting, "No damned man kills me and lives." Both of them survived until Stuart had that fella hanged for attempted murder. Anyway, Stuart will actually die during the war. He's killed in battle in 1864, and that's a fairly severe. Both of those losses are pretty darn severe for the South. And this would be General Robert E. Lee in his uniform. Interestingly, one of the things Lee did was throughout the war, he only ever wore colonel's rank insignia because he had attained the rank of colonel in the U.S. Army prior to secession and going to the South, etc. And he said that he would not wear general's insignia, general's markings, until the South had won its independence, had gotten for sure separate from the Union, and he could say that yes, this was a real army and a real nation and all of that sort of thing. So he had decided that he would only wear his colonel's insignia from that he had actually already earned. After the war's over, like I said, he did survive. After the war ends, he will eventually become president of Washington University, which is now known as Washington and Lee University in Virginia, and he'll serve several years in that position. This might surprise y'all, but I have a few pet peeves in the world, and one of them has to do with the Civil War. It's a minor thing, I know, but it is a peeve of mine, something that people get wrong constantly, and it has to do with vexillology. So if any of y'all know what that is, that's a neat thing to know. And here is that peeve. This image is not the Confederate flag. That is the battle standard of the Army of Tennessee. It is not the Confederate flag. No matter how many times people tell you it is, it's not. Simply isn't, is not. These are the Confederate flags. For a country that only lasted 4 or so years, they went through a lot of national flags. They had 3 official ones. The first one is known as the Stars and Bars. It had the original version had 7 stars. Eventually, they increased that as states seceded and joined the CSA. And so 1 star for each state, 3 stripes, red, white, and red. However, they discovered that when this was hanging limp, if there wasn't a good breeze, it was easily mistaken for an American flag. So that would never do. So they changed the design. And so the second design, number 2 there, is the second official Confederate national flag. This one is called the Stainless Banner. It has the familiar St. Andrew's cross. That's what the blue X is a St. Andrew's cross, covered in stars, of which there are 13. But the rest of it is white. And what they found out was, again, if it wasn't streaming, so if it was hanging limply because there wasn't enough breeze, it looked like a plain white flag. That is the flag that you put up when you want to have a truce to discuss things, or a parley. So that would never do. And so they moved to the third flag, and they added a red stripe to the end of that stainless banner. And that'll be the last of the flags that they have. They probably would have changed it again eventually, but they ran out of time and the Confederacy collapsed. And at that point, really, who cared? But it's just a pet peeve of mine. It bugs me when people call that other flag the Confederate flag, because it's just incorrect.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible sword. His truth is marching on.
Okay, just a quick map so that you can see how everything lays out. Again, one more time, you've got the darker blue, those are Union free states. The pink line is the boundary between Confederate and Union states, so you can see where the division is. The gray states north of the pink line are the border states. Those are areas where slavery was legal, but they stayed in the Union. The light blue states, that's territories. They're neither in, they're just outside of the system a little bit. And then, of course, the rest of the gray states are the Confederate states. Most of the fighting is going to take place in the east. That's where the biggest armies are, over in the area of Northern Virginia, around Washington, D.C., and Maryland. So that's where most of the fighting is going to take place. But the biggest battle actually takes place in Pennsylvania, just to the north, up there in Pennsylvania, north of Virginia and Maryland. So there were hundreds and hundreds of battles fought in this war. It was fought all over the place. They fought it in the east, they fought it in the west, they fought it on the seas. So it's just a very widespread war. All across the continent, really. But we're going to talk about a few of them. Only some of the sort of turning point, major point-making ones. The first Battle of Bull Run is the first major battle of the war, and it takes place near a little creek called the Bull Run, north of the railroad junction at Manassas, Virginia. And one of the things that you need to know if you're going to study the Civil War is that a lot of the battles have two names, because the North used one kind of naming system and the South used another. The North tended to name things, if it wasn't in a town, they would name it after the nearest body of water, the Bull Run. Or if it was the South, they would name it for the nearest railroad junction, which in this case is Manassas Railroad Station. Not really a town, though. So sometimes you'll hear it called the First Battle of Manassas. And they call it the First Battle because there's another battle fought basically the same place a few years later. Both sides, this is the first major battle, both sides think that this is going to be the only battle of the war. They think this one big battle is going to win the war. The South says, and then on to Washington. And the North says, and then on to Richmond, which was the Confederate capital. The Confederacy is going to win. The North is so convinced they're going to win, and it's so near Washington, D.C., that actually a bunch of congressmen come along with the army. They bring their families in a picnic lunch, and they set up on a hillside kind of off to the side of the battlefield, and they're going to watch their triumphant troops destroy the rebel forces and march on to victory. And when the Confederacy turns around and wins, they're in a bad spot. They got to run like rabbits to get back to the safety of Washington, D.C., which is surrounded by forts and protected. And what happens is inexperienced Union troops outnumber the Confederates, but as the fighting goes on, they don't get any reinforcements, and the Confederates do. And at one point, it does look like the Union troops are going to win. They're pushing the Confederates back, and this is when they get all tired out. They're pushing the Confederates back, but one group of Confederate soldiers under the command of a fellow by the name of Thomas Jackson just refuses to retreat, even though things are looking bad. And so he gets a nickname from it. His nickname is Stonewall, and that's because another commander for the South sees Jackson and his Virginian troops standing there, and he says, "See the Virginians standing there like a stone wall. Rally round the Virginians, boys." And so that's how he gets the nickname. So, like, the Southern victory shocks the North, but they're so tired from fighting that day that they really can't follow up on this big victory and win the war like they thought they would be able to. So it doesn't end up being the one battle war. And as a matter of fact, that idea, though, is going to carry on for quite a while. That just one more big battle, just this next one, they're going to throw in the towel. And it just never gets to that point, really. In a war full of firsts, the Battle of Hampton Roads is another first conflict. This time, it's the first time that two ironclad ships will meet in battle for the very first time. And it happens in March of 1862. And it changes naval warfare forever, because what it does is it proves that if your enemy has ironclads and you have regular old wooden ships, you lose. But if you both have ironclads, you've got a chance. And so when these two fight, and it's the two ships involved are the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. The Virginia had been known as the Merrimack. The Confederates had captured it earlier in the war and rebuilt it. So they renamed it the Virginia rather than the Merrimack. So sometimes you hear it called the Monitor versus the Merrimack, or the Monitor versus the Virginia. The battle takes place at Hampton Roads, which is off the coast of Virginia, and so it's called the Battle of Hampton Roads. Anyway, but you'll often hear it referred to as the Monitor versus the Merrimack. And the battle itself was sort of anticlimactic. The two ships are going to fight for about 4 hours before they both have to withdraw and go home, go back to their respective bases, basically, because they're low on ammunition and low on coal. And they've got to have coal for fuel for steam, which is how they were powered. So the battle is really kind of a draw, but both sides will claim victory in the newspapers. The Confederates will be like, "We ran off that Yankee raider," and the North's newspapers talk about stymieing the Confederate blockade smasher and stuff like that. So what it's doing, though, is proving the value of the idea of ironclads. And both sides try to build as many as they can. Again, the Union's going to end up with a lot more of them because the Union has more ability to build the things, just like everything else. Eventually, the Monitor is going to be lost at sea. When you see a picture of her in the next slide, you'll see why. She didn't hardly stick up out of the water at all, and so in any kind of a storm, she would have a lot of water go over her decks, and too much water got over the decks, and she flooded and she was sunk. They did find her a few years ago, and they brought up parts of her, and part of it's in a museum at Norfolk, Virginia. The Virginia is going to end up actually being captured by the Confederates themselves, or not captured, but destroyed by the Confederates themselves in order to prevent it being captured towards the end of the war, when things are looking bad and the Confederates have to abandon the naval base where they've been keeping her. So the ship on the left is the Monitor, and it had the nickname the cheese box on a raft because the turret looked like a box that you would put a big round wheel of cheese in, and it just barely sat above the waterline. But that turret allowed it a lot of strategic or tactical flexibility in that it could shoot in any direction, which most ships at the time couldn't do. It also made it really hard to hit because it wasn't very big. The ship on the right is the Virginia, and you can see how the sides of the Virginia are kind of sloped, which meant that cannonballs that hit it would glance off like a pool ball hitting a bumper on a pool table at an angle. The Battle of Shiloh was fought in April of 1862, about a year after the start of the war. It's going to be the bloodiest battle of the war up to that point. There will be worse battles later on. It's 2 days long, but it's important because of two things. One is that the massive casualty lists from this 2-day battle are going to be the thing that convinces most people that the year-long dream of one more battle and this war is over, one more battle and this war is over, is just that, nothing but a dream. And that there will not be a quick and painless end to this war, and it's going to be bad. The other thing that's important about it is that it is where Ulysses S. Grant really starts to shine. He was the Union commander at the battle, and the first day goes very badly for him, but he regroups, even though his aides are telling him, sir, we need to retreat, we need to leave. He and his troops remain. He gets some support from gunboats on the river. They're right there at next to the Tennessee River, if I recall correctly, and they managed to drive off the Confederates. Partially they are victorious because one of the casualties for the Confederate side is their General Albert Sidney Johnston, and he's killed. And then there's sort of a question of who is in charge after that. And so there's some confusion amongst the Confederates. The Union hasn't retreated, and they've gotten more support in the form of those river gunboats. And so the Confederates will actually lose this battle. September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam was fought. And that's going to end up being the bloodiest single day in American history. The battle was fought only over a single day. It was part of Robert E. Lee's failed invasion of the Union, his first attempt to do that in what's called the Peninsula Campaign. And over 25,000 Americans are going to be killed or wounded in just one day. And that's folks with no machine guns, no bombs, muzzle-loading cannons and rifles, single shot, everything. No tanks, no poison gas, no any of that sort of thing. 25,000 Americans killed or wounded in just one day. That's incredible. The fighting was so intense that it actually set the woods on fire. Where they were part of where they were fighting was in some woods. The Union general is McClellan, and McClellan had a massive advantage in this fight. He had a copy of Lee's orders, his battle plans. This is like having, if you were going to play baseball or football and you had the other team's playbook, so that every time they called something, you knew what they were going to be doing before, even as fast as they did, or maybe even before they did it, you could adjust and make it to your advantage. And that's absolutely what they did. Lee figured out pretty quickly that something had gone wrong. That one of his officers had actually dropped his copy of the battle plans, the orders, and that they had been recovered, obviously, by McClellan's soldiers and passed to McClellan. And so Lee figures that out, and as the casualties mount, he has to retreat. Okay, high casualties force him to retreat, and he pulls away in pretty good order, but moving quickly. And here's where McClellan makes his mistake. Lee's forces are hurt. They are struggling to get away, and McClellan, who doesn't know how many soldiers Lee has compared to how many soldiers he's got, McClellan outnumbers him heavily. But Jeb Stuart's doing a really good job of keeping McClellan from finding that out. McClellan was afraid that Lee was leading him into a trap. He thought Lee was very clever, and Lee was clever, but that wasn't what was happening. And so what he does is, rather than risk his army being savaged in an attack, he can't afford to look like he's lost. He won the battle. The enemy has fled the field. He's won. But what he's wanting to do is keep his casualties as little as possible. And that's a good thing in one way, but it's a bad thing in another, because if he had gone through with it and just followed up, it would have ended the war in September of 1862 instead of in April of 1865. And it would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives in the long run. Part of the reason McClellan's doing that is he actually has some plans to get into politics after the war is over. And so he wants a reputation of being that guy who looked out for his men and everything. So McClellan is too cautious, doesn't follow up. He loses out on a chance to destroy Lee's army once and for all, which would have ended the war. And when Lincoln finds out about it, he fires McClellan. So after Antietam, McClellan is going to be replaced with a fellow by the name of Ambrose Burnside. And there's General Burnside there. Yes, he has a magnificent set of sideburns. Yes, that is supposedly where they get the nickname. McClellan had been fired, like I just mentioned, for being too cautious, too timid, too protective of his troops. So Burnside basically went the other way. He was far too aggressive. And with a better than 2-to-1 advantage in soldiers, he's going to attack the city of Fredericksburg in Virginia. And he had been a little bit sneaky. He had sort of suckered the South, Lee and Jackson, out of position and sort of turned and gone around the end of, he would have been able to sneak past the Southern armies, except that he didn't have a bridge. He was waiting for some pontoons to come to create a series of pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock River, which runs right there past Fredericksburg, and which he had to cross in order to move further south. And those got delayed. And because of that delay, partly, Lee and his soldiers were able to get back down to the Fredericksburg area to protect the city and defend against this attack. But instead of calling off the attack, Burnside goes ahead and carries it through. And essentially what he does is he crosses the river, takes massive casualties doing that, fights street to street through the city, takes a lot of casualties doing that. Then he gets up and he starts feeding men into what amounts to a meat grinder at a place called Mary's Heights, where as they're leaving the town and trying to get to the Confederates are all dug in on some hilltops, and they just thrash these Union soldiers to the tune of killing more than 2-to-1. And it's a major disaster. And the Confederates lose very few, relatively speaking. The Union loses quite a few. This is over the course of about 3 days of fighting. And when he finally withdraws his army, Burnside doesn't wait around to be fired. He actually will end up resigning in shame for his failure. So next up is going to be Joseph Fighting Joe Hooker, who replaces Burnside as the Union commander. And he's going to fight against Lee at a place called Chancellorsville, which is not very far from Fredericksburg. And instead of going straight at Lee like Burnside had, Hooker decides he's going to kind of swing around the side and get past and get behind Lee. And that's a great idea. But Lee knows what he's doing because, again, of Jeb Stuart's help. And so what happens is Lee will split his troops and send most of them with Stonewall Jackson around Hooker's army to attack them from behind. So he goes around, he outflanks the attempt to outflank him. Hooker is completely surprised by this. Jeb Stuart and his troops are doing a great job. And as a result of this surprise, Hooker's troops are going to be just totally shocked, defeated handily, and they retreat. The only thing that really saves them is the fact that it gets dark. So that night, Jackson does something that was really kind of foolish, and he shouldn't have done it. It was a job for a lieutenant and not a general. But what he does is he goes and he scouts out Hooker's forces and tries to see where they are for himself, and rather than relying on reports from someone else. And when he does, he goes with a few bodyguards. He wasn't completely stupid. So he goes and he's found by some Union cavalry, and those guys on horses chase Jackson and his men back to the Confederate camp. And as they're riding to the Confederate camp, Hall and Butt, riding their horses in the dark, they get challenged by some sentries, the guys who are out on watch to make sure nobody sneaks up and does anything to the camp at night. And when these guys come riding up, the sentries shoot at them, and they hit Jackson in the arm. And he has to have his arm operated on. He gets an infection, and 10 days later will die of pneumonia. And when he does, Lee says he feels as if he has lost his strong right arm, because Jackson was the fellow on whom he really relied. He really trusted Jackson with his most important things, and he knew that Jackson could take care of it. And so that was very bad news for the South when Jackson was accidentally killed by his own troops. The Battle of Gettysburg takes place in early July, the first 3 days of July in 1863. And what's happened is in June of 1863, Lee attacked the North for the second and last time. He's trying to sneak around and capture Washington, D.C. If they can do that, they'll probably end the war. And so he's marched around and he's trying to get around behind Washington, D.C. He's hoping Maryland will rise and secede and all of that as well. And on July 1st, some of his soldiers go into this little town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And they went in there actually looking for shoes. They're starting to run really short on a lot of equipment. One of the things that they're having trouble doing is keeping themselves with proper shoes on their feet. They're walking everywhere and they're wearing their shoes out. They run into a Union patrol and start shooting, and then the two armies hear that shooting and they march towards the sound of the guns. And so what ends up happening is a 3-day-long battle, which will be the largest battle that's ever been fought in North America to this time, and the bloodiest battle ever fought in North America to this point in history. By this point, I mean like right now. The two armies line up along parallel ridges, lines of hills, and with a low area in between them. And to fight, they have to basically cross that area, and it's pretty open. The rebels are on what's known as Seminary Ridge. The Yankees are on what's known as Cemetery Ridge. And the climax of the battle is going to take place on the third day, when Lee, who believes that he has stopped the Union artillery, he believes he has blown it all up and that they don't have any cannons left to shoot at his men with. And he's wrong. He makes a mistake about that. And so he orders a charge across that open ground, thinking that his troops will be safe. And it's known as Pickett's charge. And it's torn to pieces because Lee was wrong. Here's a map showing that charge where Pickett comes across. It's the one circled in yellow there in the center. You can see how the two sides are sort of lined up. You've got one along Seminary Ridge, one on the red, that's the Confederates. They actually wrapped around the Union positions to a large degree. They also, you've got the Union troops there in the blue line along Cemetery Ridge. And so Pickett and his men come across this open ground between the ridges, and that's when the Union guns open up again. And what had happened was they had stopped shooting their cannons to bring up more ammunition and to save ammunition. So they had just paused in their shooting, and they get more ammunition, and just as they do, here comes Pickett and his men. And over 5,000 Confederate soldiers are going to be killed or wounded in the roughly an hour that this attack lasted. That's more than one of them per second. They get caught out in the open and they just get cut to pieces. And with that, Lee is going to have to retreat. Again, he's forced to return to Virginia. He's got to try to rebuild his army one more time, just like he had after Antietam. And they go back to Virginia. And from this point on, though, and this is part of why the Battle of Gettysburg is such an important battle, and you really need to know that it is a very important battle. From this point on, there is zero real chance for the Southern forces to win the war. Okay? As far as getting a military victory, this is pretty much the end of their hopes for that.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Okay, the siege of Vicksburg takes place as part of the Union's Anaconda Plan that old Winfield Scott had come up with back at the start of the war, where it's the second part where they're going to cut the South in half by getting control of the Mississippi River, and that isolates Louisiana and Arkansas and Texas from the rest of the South. And why that matters is because during the Civil War, supplies could be brought to Mexico, which was basically being run by the French at the time, and then shipped overland to get to the Confederacy. While it took a while, it was a safe route. And of course, the Anaconda Plan is trying to cut off those supplies to the South. And so taking control of the Mississippi was really important. Vicksburg, a town in Mississippi, is the last of the major strongholds that the Confederates had along the Mississippi River. And it's the last place where they've got a bridge that is a railroad bridge across the river. And that's a big deal because that means they don't have any other railroads that can cross over the river, which means they can't bring stuff by rail. slows things down a lot. So Ulysses S. Grant surrounded the city in the May of 1863. And for about 6 weeks, the defenders are going to hold out. Now, this is civilians and soldiers, and they begin to starve. They run out of food. By the end of the siege, there's not an animal basically left alive in the city. People are eating rats. People are eating horses. People are eating anything that they can get their hands on. People were living in small caves that they dug out of the cliffside. There's sort of some cliffs and bluffs and hills in the city, in the town. And the civilians had dug themselves shelters in them because of all of the exploding cannonballs and things to protect themselves from that. Vicksburg will surrender on the 4th of July, 1863. And the guy running the show for the Confederates at Vicksburg did it on purpose on the 4th of July, hoping that because it was the 4th of July, that Grant would give him more favorable surrender terms. He doesn't. He just says, nope, you can surrender or you can starve. Those are your options. And he surrenders. Anyway, but now the South is cut in two. It does make for a really happy 4th of July, though, because just the day before, the Battle of Gettysburg had ended in a major victory for the Union as well. As a result of his success at Vicksburg, Grant is going to be brought to the east to fight against Lee. Now, it takes a while. Okay, it's going to be almost, about 8 or 9 months before he actually takes over. Partly because he's got to get his armies back into shape over here, get a new guy out there, get him up and running, then Grant has to get over to the east, and they have to hand over command to him, and they have to rebuild that army and everything. So it's going to be several months before Grant is really ready to get going. But the victory at Vicksburg is what's going to get him there. So after Grant's victories in Vicksburg, he comes to be the most well thought of Lincoln's generals. And so Lincoln is going to, in March of 1864, bring him from the west over to the east and put him in charge of the Army of the Potomac. And part of Grant's plan is to, now that the Anaconda Plan is working and they've cut the South in two at the Mississippi, he says, we're going to further section them off and we're going to break up their connection from Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. We're going to cut those parts off from Florida. We're going to cut those off from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. And so we're going to keep breaking off pieces. And to do that, he sends one of his subordinates, a fellow by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman, William T. Sherman, through Georgia to the Atlantic coast. And he tells him, make 'em holler. And so Sherman pursues a plan of total war. He wrecks everything in a miles-wide swath of devastation. He moves through the state of Georgia, and what they can't steal, they destroy. And they steal food and horses, they burn homes and crops, they destroy wells, they tear up railroads, bridges, everything they can do to damage the South on their way through. And they rob people. There are some atrocities. Sherman doesn't really want them to commit atrocities on the civilian population. He doesn't mind them looting, taking stuff, but they're not supposed to be raping. They're not supposed to be murdering civilians. And of course, if anybody raised a hand against them, that was it. You were done. So he's pushing down through Georgia, and he starts in, I believe it was May. And by September, he's gone all the way to Atlanta. And when he captures Atlanta, he will send a notice to Lincoln saying, I've captured Atlanta. And that really helps Lincoln out and hurts the South, because Lincoln was actually facing a really strong challenge in that election. It's 1864, it's an election year. And George McClellan, the general, or former general, is running against Lincoln. And he's running by saying, I promise to end this war. Not by winning it, but by ending it. We're just going to let the South go. They're not that important to us. We'll just let them go. And Lincoln was wrong for fighting all this time and spending all these people's lives to continue this war when there's just no end in sight and they're just not worth it. And the South is really, really hoping that McClellan will win, because that's at this point really their only hope of independence. However, Sherman forestalls that. His capture of Atlanta in September helps to Lincoln win re-election, and when Lincoln is reelected, that's pretty much the last political nail in the coffin. Now it's only a matter of time. Sherman will capture Savannah on the coast in December of 1864, right at Christmas time, and again sends a message to Lincoln saying, I present to you for Christmas the city of Savannah, sir, or something to that effect. And here's one more map showing how Sherman progressed from Chattanooga, which is where he started, Chattanooga, Tennessee, right there on the border between Tennessee and Georgia, marched south in continuing steps, and from May of 64 to September, he arrives in Atlanta. Remember, he's left just a wake of devastation behind him. His troops will burn Atlanta, sparing only a few buildings, mostly churches and hospitals. And he will send word to Lincoln and then continue on his way. And along the way, again, just tearing up everything. Atlanta was important because if you see on that in this map, a lot of railroads, some of the fairly major railroads meet up there. And so by taking Atlanta and destroying all those railroads, he helped cut off parts of the South from each other. And he continued on to the coast, the Atlantic Ocean, in the port city, important port of Savannah. From there, he turned northward and marched up through South Carolina. And everything he did to Georgia, he did to South Carolina 3 times over, because, well, South Carolina had started all of this nonsense by being the first to secede. So he really punished them, and then continued to march northward into North Carolina, where he finally gets Johnston, who he's been following this whole time, to surrender. And with that, we're going to end it for today. And our next lecture is going to be about ending the war, not really fighting the war, but just how kind of it ended. And then the period after the war, which is called Reconstruction. And that's going to be the last lecture for this semester. So we'll see you then.